Hello and welcome to another episode of Wagon Wheel with Jarrod Kimber. This is Wagon Wheel. I am Jarrod Kimber. There we go. We've got most of the details out of the way early on. This podcast / chat / I don't know whatever else is video, I suppose, can be found in a multitude of ways. You could follow us at Spotify Green Room and you'll get an alert. You can also go to YouTube when we put them up. Which is we're starting to almost put up one a week, which is how many we record. And there's also obviously on the Red Inca feed when they go up every Saturday there. But a huge thanks to everyone for coming into the room and supporting us there. Big thanks to Manscaped. Remember, you can get a discount with Manscaped. You can shave your testicles in the best possible way that your testicles have ever been shaved with Manscaped's Lawnmower 4.0. If you put in the code Red Inca, all one word, you get a discount and free worldwide shipping. Do it. Supports the podcast, but more importantly, it maintains your personal grooming habits, and it's a very good product. And I only say that because they gave me one for free and I used it. But I've also asked my producers, and they also are big fans of Manscaped. Thanks to Bodyline t-shirts as well for all their t-shirts, of which, of course, I forgot to pick one up because we're recording again today. Sorry about that. And a huge thanks to everyone on Buy Me a Coffee who's been chipping in when they can, when they like either a podcast or a video or some articles. But most of all, thanks to the Patreons, because this podcast is made available by them. We could only afford to do one normally, but because of the Patreon support and all the patrons over there, we have the ability to do two. We are building towards three podcasts, if at all podcastable. And for that, obviously, we just need some more support. But we're looking for sponsors as well, and moving the podcast around a little bit. Might be some slight changes coming up, but nothing that anyone will notice or care about that much. I'm hoping. But huge thanks to everyone. And remember, if you're on the Patreon and you select the tier above or first class and above, you get a chance to ask questions first, like these questions. Weird. Sorry. First one is, why did Shane Warne underperform in India? That's by Will. I think partly he's a bit more of a slower spinner. I think he probably had a similar thing to other Australian spinners when they go to India, is that overspin is a far more effective tool there. So I think those two are the most important ones. I think there was a particularly good bunch of Indian batters, especially in the pre-DRS era. It would have been very interesting for a peak Shane Warne to go to India when the umpires have been trained in DRS and the LBWs, because obviously the way that everyone played spinners had to change massively. So I think all those things would have helped him. I do think his pace was quite interesting. The other thing that people forget is that Shane Warne didn't actually take a lot of wickets in the West Indies either. It wasn't his only region. It just sticks out because everything about India gets talked about a lot more than things from the West Indies do. Part of the reason he struggled in the West Indies was obviously Brian Lara related. Also Shivnor and Chandrapal. So there was a couple of very, very good left-handers that he had to go up against. Again, the pitches could be quite slow in the West Indies, so I think that's another one. And I think because he bowled about 78 kilometers an hour, which would now be, one of the slowest spinners in the world. He might have been slightly high, he might have been 80 or 81, but he was around that period. I think players who were very good at using their feet against him caused him problems. And generally in that period of cricket, the players who used their feet the best against spinners were probably the Indians and the West Indians. So I think that probably all played a fairly big part in what happened there. It's also possible that in India specifically, that if you go through the history of India, you either have different kinds of leg spinners, the sort of the faster ones. So, Anil Kumble with his straighter balls and Chandra Sekhar as well. They actually haven't had that much success in India with wrist spinners, more traditional sorts of wrist spinners that we've seen in Pakistan and Australia. So I wonder if there's something to do with, the pitches actually help finger spinners a little bit more. I don't know if that's true. Just having a look at the way that spinners develop in India, it's quite interesting anyway. Certainly finger spinners do well there. Will says, why do people assume Pakistan has spinning tracks when they often produce roads. Yeah, I haven't had a deep look into how many roads they've done yet. I mean, we've only just come back to Pakistan, but they certainly have pitches that help bowlers, and sometimes they have spinning pitches, and sometimes they have quick pitches. So, I mean, spinners have traditionally done very well in Pakistan. Abdul Qadir, Mushtaq Ahmed, Saqlain Mushtaq. Who am I missing? Missing someone. Oh, yes, Shah, of more recent time. So it would be silly to say that Pakistani pitchers don't help spin bowlers. They probably help seamers more than some other parts of the subcontinent. India traditionally, although not recently. Sri Lanka definitely. So I think they do sort of get characterized into that. But also, as you saw in that particular wicket, they can be quite slow and low and unresponsive. And I suppose on those sorts of wickets, generally you end up going to your spinners anyway, because otherwise you'll kill your quicks. So even if they're not always ranked turners the way that some of the other pitches are, you have to rely on your spinners a lot more in Pakistan than in other places. Chris says, could we have another West Indies in cricket in terms of grouping nations participating as one to try and make waves at the top level? Using Scandinavia as an example, you could have 5 countries. It's funny, I get often asked this question a lot. I don't know if people know that the Irish team is 2 different nations, Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. So, I mean, straight away we have another situation when we do that. There's nothing to stop us in cricket from doing that. The only thing that would ever stop us in cricket from doing that would be the Olympics. Because going ahead, it would be trickier. I mean, the Caribbean islands are going to find that out when they try and qualify for the Olympics, right? It's a different situation. They're not really set up to do it. That said, at the Olympics, we'd also have Team GB instead of England, wouldn't we? Which would be another one of these teams that you're talking about, Chris. But yeah, I don't think there's anything stopping anyone doing it. I mean, the fact that the West Indies happened and now Ireland have happened, kind of just feels like it's a cricket thing. Very weird compared to other places. Obviously, I suppose you've got the British Lions in the rugby union. I know they don't play in the World Cup, but they obviously go on tours together. So it seems to be a thing that happens in cricket more than other sports. So I don't see any reason why we couldn't have a Scandinavian 11, or what else could you have? The other one was East Africa. Who was in that? Was that Kenya, Rwanda, Uganda? No, I'm trying to remember now. I should know that because I've looked it up recently. But yeah, I think that was Rwanda and Uganda. Anyway, they played in the World Cup. So we've had, what's that, off the top of my head, 3 versions of it. And if we had the Olympics, we'd have 4 versions of it. So it's certainly something that happens, Chris. I don't know how much it will happen in the future. It's politically, I mean, the West Indies shouldn't exist, right? Politically, it's been a nightmare. Ireland have managed to keep it together, but there's certainly people, there's certainly a pull between the North and the South at times in Irish cricket. There's absolutely no doubt of that. But so far, they've managed to keep it together. But I would think that's the main reason why it wouldn't happen is no one would be happy. Sandeep says, what to make of the new MCC rule that if a batter is out caught, the new batter will come at the end of the striker? Was that? Why this rule change now? I can't think of the old rule being deliberately misused. Now, this is a very, very good question. I'll tell you why. The old rule wasn't misused, but the old rule realistically wasn't benefiting the person who did the good work, which was the bowler. Previously, I don't think it mattered that much because you don't have that many skied catches in test matches, right? So it didn't make any sense. From a T20 or a one-day perspective, here's the best way of pointing it out. So I don't know if Trent Woodhill devised this rule in the 100 that's become a law in all cricket. But Trent Woodhill was the first person that I ever heard talk about it publicly, and I actually talked to him about it privately quite a bit as well. And he was saying, let's say you're bowling in an IPL final, and you've got the opposition 7 wickets down, and it's RCB. I don't know why they're in this final, but they are. You've got the opposition 7 wickets down, or 6 wickets down, and you take your 7th wicket. At one end, AB de Villiers is off 40 off 15. And at the other end, a guy's basically hit the ball straight up in the air, and now AB de Villiers is on strike and has the ability to attack you. Why should you be penalised for taking a wicket? And that's what was happening towards the end of games. It's a bit like the sacrifice bunt in baseball. Tailenders especially were almost having a free swing. Because the worst case scenario, they'd get the good batter back on strike. And best case scenario, they might be able to hit a 6, right? But if it did go straight up in the air and they got caught, well, at least they'd get the good batter on strike. That's really not what should happen. If you've taken a wicket, you should be getting, if you're taking a bowling wicket specifically, run-outs are obviously a little bit different because it's the end you're running at. But if you're taking a bowling wicket, you should definitely get a benefit of that. I don't think it will affect Test cricket very much at all. I think that we'll have some very big impacts at the end of T20 and one-day games where you might see extra wickets fall because tailenders will come in and continue to face rather than getting off strike. I'm a very big fan of it. I think most of the changes they made, the tweak to the wide law was overdue. I've certainly been talking about that for about 10 years. Taking the man card out of unfair play, obvious one. I'm trying to think what else they did. But yeah, I have had a bit of a look at it. I don't think I'll get a chance to do a video on them because there's so much cricket going on at the moment. But I was a pretty big fan of all those changes. Off the top of my head, I'd have to go back and check if there's one I didn't like. Oh, the saliva one, if they use the science for that, then I'll back the science over, my own opinion on saliva. I mean, I'm all, as a general rule in life, I'm all for spitting on things less. Ian says, thanks for your podcast with John Norman about Shane Warne. Hypothetical question. As you said, prior to the ball of the century in England, Warne had an unspectacular start to his Test career, and Graham Hicker flogged him around at the tour game. So, how different is Australia cricket in the 90s and 2000s if Warne got smashed out of the side on that tour? Do you think McGill gets more caps? Do you think Australia eschews spin? It is interesting. One thing I would say, and I happen to have Shane Warne's stats here because of that, because of the previous question. Is even if he got hammered in England in that first series, I think they would have continued to go with him. And the reason is, I think he'd already taken wickets. So he'd already taken the wickets against Sri Lanka in that last test. He'd then taken the 7 against the West Indies. And then he took an absolute bucket against New Zealand as well. So he took 17 wickets in 3 tests in New Zealand. So I think even if that's the case, I know this might sound silly, and he, I don't know, averaged 45 in England. I don't think that slows down the Warne train. He certainly would have come back to Australia. I mean, Australia was his best surface, right? I think when you watch him bowl, other than maybe bowling in Sri Lanka, which really suited him as well. I think Australia, he was almost at his most dangerous consistently, even if he had some better records occasionally when he toured. So I don't think that hypothetical can stand up. If you were just to say, but we could do it a different way. Let's just say he got injured before he even played against New Zealand. So he took the 7 gets injured. That's when he has his first finger injury, his first shoulder injury. Yeah, I think McGill would have come in and out. I think he would have been mistreated. I think McGill was even slower than Warne, so he would have really struggled occasionally in some of those Asian tours. I think we know from McGill's personality that I think he would have really struggled to be the frontline Australian spinner consistently, especially when the bowlers were so good. I don't know if people really know that much, but if you go back to Steve Waugh sort of pushed Warne to the side a little bit. It was more about the pace bowling. He was less interested in Warne. He almost used Warne as a stock bowler at times in a way that Border and Taylor had used him as the frontline striker. So if that's the case, I think McGill would have had an interesting career. You also have the Colin Miller period as well, which would have been very, very interesting without Warne consistently, although sometimes Miller played without Warne. But would he have played more? Would he have played earlier? Would they have got rid of him as quickly? It still would have been a fantastic team because you still would have had McGrath and Gillespie, Fleming when he was fit, and Brett Lee available to them, plus the backup sort of bowlers of Rifle, Kasperwitz, Bickle. It was still a fantastic team. Tim May as well. There was a lot of very good bowlers around at that time, plus the batters and the fact they had Gilchrist, which was a big point of difference. I think without Warne, Gilchrist probably about 6 is one thing I would say. I think they would have tried all-rounders a lot more without Warne. But yeah, it's a very good question. Recently, many commentators, James says, recently many commentators suggest that part of England, the solution to England's woes is to bring back cricket in state schools. However, England doesn't have a local club structure similar to that of Australia. Wouldn't that be the sensible target for directing resources? Okay, well, firstly, I always believe that you have to go back to where people are producing cricketers. And England is producing cricketers in schools, just not in schools that are government funded. So I honestly do believe that those sorts of models are very, very important. Secondly, I don't know how you force a club structure on. Club structure is really a societal thing, I would have thought. I could be wrong here, James, but I would have thought that it's a societal thing. I always believe that the best thing to do is to work out how you are producing cricketers and support that. And I think at the moment, the Asian cricketers are coming sometimes through those tape ball competitions, those sort of secondary competitions. I would be supporting them. And I would be supporting the school system, because I think if you look at the history of English cricket, that is where the majority of cricketers have come, originally from state schools and private schools, but now just private schools. So I think if you want to get cricket back into the state schools, that is I can't see that as being a negative, James. I think if you spend a lot of money on the club system, just don't know that is the perfect way for England cricket to survive. It's, the Australian club system is so strong and so big and so, Mitchell Starc plays in that. Joe Root's not going to go back to Sheffield Reigate and play a game. It's a different kind of club system, I suppose, is what I'm trying to say. So even if you beefed up club cricket in England, which I assume you could, I'm not sure it's going to have the same impact that it would ever have in Australia, just because it's not set up to be the same thing. You get picked for your first-class teams because of your performances in club cricket, more or less in Australia. That's not the English system, and the way it's set up, I don't think that would ever be the English system. So it is quite different in that particular way. Johnny says, what do analysts look at when deciding who to buy or select for a cricket team? Are they ever looking at the same stats as fans, like average strike rate, etc.? Or are they only looking at stats that are far more complex? Look, it's very different for everyone, Johnny, I'll be honest. I don't think... one thing I like to do is I want to know the quality of an overall player. I will quite often look at that first-class average or first-class average of a player, especially if I'm looking at bowlers, because I want to know if they always take wickets everywhere or if they're just an effective T20 bowler, because I want to know, on days when I need wickets, are they going to be able to make wickets happen? Those sorts of things. So I certainly use average there. There's so many advanced metrics out there that I don't think, outside of maybe your top 3, I don't think you'd look at averages that much. You're really looking at the advanced metrics of, how many runs per innings are they worth more to a team than that. You've got runs above average metrics, you've got expected average metrics, all those sorts of things. But it probably depends on individual analysts. I would hate to say that no analysts look at that. Strike rate is far more important. But having said that, the true strike rate that I have, which some analysts use, is way more important than normal strike rate, of course. Coaches and owners certainly look at normal stats a lot more and are far more interested in that. So it still becomes part of the process. But I wouldn't want to speak for all analysts, but I know a good deal of our analysts do not do that. A lot of analysts don't even worry so much about that. They're looking at, you might look at average or strike rate, but for a period of the game. And you might still use those normal metrics in that period, just because that's what, legitimately, that's what you're looking for. Thanks for that, Johnny. Andrew says, who are you backing tomorrow's Marsh Cup final, Australia, eh? I'm assuming he means Western Australia there, or New South Wales. I haven't watched a ball of the Marsh Cup tournament so far. But any team with Berendorf, if he's fit, I'll go for him just because I like him. And Anmol says, is there any other board who is as bad as the BCCI in running their women's cricket? I think you need to look at my recent video on Sri Lankan cricket, Anmol. And can women's IPL be financially sustainable as a standalone tournament? Yeah, well, Pakistan were terrible with their women's side as well. Bangladesh has recently done some really good work with theirs. South Africa were terrible for their women's side for a very, very long time. So yeah, BCCI not on their own. Where BCCI is on their own is, I think in 2018 I had this conversation with this guy on Twitter, and I was saying it is ridiculous the BCCI does not have an IPL, considering the money that is in the women's IPL. Sorry, the money that's there. And he said, in 2 or 3 years they'll have it. They'll have it for sure. They're just getting everything right. And I was like, but they could have it now. And I would sell this to the BCCI as a nationalistic thing. If you actually had a women's IPL and you had the top 100, 200 Indian women paid for correctly, you beefed up your domestic system as well. So maybe you had 400 from semi-professional all the way through to fully, properly paid professionals. I really think that Indian women would dominate cricket for a very, very long time, very quickly. And at the moment, that's not happening. And, it's misogyny. It's also bad business sense, because I can tell you one thing that I learned during the 100, which is how much certain companies just want to advertise with women's sport. It's stupid. And if, it's an easy gain early on to get a lot of extra marketing money. It becomes tough further down when you do get more professionals. I mean, the WNBA is one of the best examples of a league that is struggling to bring in its own money. But we haven't, I don't believe that's the case so much. So with the women's 100 and the women's big bash, they have been able to get their own sponsors, and they have been able to move towards a better version of professionalism quite quickly. But yeah, realistically, the women's IPL, even if it's not financially sustainable, as you said, it doesn't matter, because they're making so much money. I think it could be financially sustainable. I think in India you could certainly make a lot of money from it. It's usually from the market, from what I've seen, it's the sponsors that usually do better for you than the streaming and the TV rights for women's sport. But it doesn't have to be financially sustainable, I think, is the most important thing, and more, because the Big Bash wasn't financially sustainable when it started, the men's version. The 100 is not financially sustainable. The PSL was not financially sustainable. All of these tournaments, the cricket boards invested in them because they knew eventually they would be sustainable. The women's IPL would eventually make a lot of money. And even if it just became sustainable, that would be huge. But it's a potential for being a lot more than that. And with the amount of women who watch the men's IPL, I just think it's a stupid thing to not have another product available for them. So, yeah. I can't think of a single good reason not to have it. Thank you, everyone in Patreon, for your questions. And we'll go to the chat, where we have our favorite handle, Hydrogen X. How you doing, mate?
Yeah, Jarrod, so my opinion that India is currently playing Sri Lanka, and after that it's quite an easy schedule, except that one test in England. And if you look at the current England team, you might think that's also an easier test. So we saw in the recently concluded first test. How do you think about India's chances to go to the WTC final?
I've already done the video on it. If you have a look at the start, I picked Pakistan and India to get there at the start. I mean, nothing's changed. I was looking at the schedule when I came up with that.
Yes, but in that video, you selected India for winning the New Zealand series 2-0 and winning the South Africa series also. But we won the New Zealand series 1-0 only, and we lost the South Africa series. So
you did. I think I'm about 1.5 tests behind. But I was also quite conservative on how India would go all the way. But I also had them coming first, I think. They only need to come in the top 2, right? Look, I haven't gone back and had a big look at how the results have gone so far. Obviously, I wasn't expecting to get every single test or every single series completely correct. Losing away from home, but even in that South Africa series, they still won a test away from home. Sorry, is what I meant to say. Which is very important. So I'm not particularly worried. I mean, there aren't that many other teams that have good schedules. They legitimately, let's say, and I think this is probably fair to say that Australia is probably, Australia and New Zealand are two of the other strongest teams. They just don't have the schedules that it's going to allow for as many wins as Pakistan and India do. So I'd find unless Australia or New Zealand completely play out of their skin, like if New Zealand had won that series against India or won a test in that series against India, that's the sort of thing that they would have to do in order to get up there. I mean, there just aren't that many good test teams in the world. So I suppose South Africa could go on a bit of a run. But looking at the schedule, I just don't believe the other teams are strong enough to be able to get the wins to go past India and Pakistan. At the very least, I still expect India and Pakistan to be in the top 3 teams. Maybe one of them will slip out because someone else will go on a very good run. But for me, I really don't have that many fears that India is not going to make it to the WTC. And by the way, that I don't think that England test doesn't count in that does it? Or does it? Now I'm confused. Does it count in the WTC?
Yes, it will be counted and it will be played in July, the 5th test.
So because it started after the final last time. So yeah, you're right. That's another chance of them getting another away win, as you said. But I think all things considered, I mean, who are the teams that you're worried about? I mean, give me a team that you're worried about doing well.
Yeah, I don't think.
You know what I mean? I mean, there has to be another team that has to do better than India, right? Well, 2 teams that have to do better than India. Pakistan are a chance, but Pakistan, I thought Pakistan were the more tenuous of the 2 teams that I had in the World Test Championship final. Australia still has a long way to go and a lot of tests in Asia in order to be able to do it. New Zealand has a much tougher schedule. South Africa is an interesting one, but having just done the batting numbers, their batting is so weak that I can't see them consistently winning test matches. So all things considered, it's not, India might have slipped back slightly from my more bullish suggestions, but I don't think that there's great teams around the rest of the world who are going to cause too many problems. Thanks for your question, though. Siddharth.
Hello.
How you go, mate? What's your question?
Yeah, so my question is, today you uploaded this video about the West Indian bowlers and how they are doing better than the 80s era, where they had probably the best fast bowling unit of all time. And it just got me thinking. So before the 4 bowlers that they assembled, they had Lance Gibbs, of course, which was probably the greatest spin bowler without a doubt. And but how did they manage to get those 4 bowlers and play? I know that we had significantly less test matches in those days, so the bowlers didn't have to bowl that much. But for 4 fast bowlers, 3 of them probably genuinely fast, you'd say, and Joel Garner, all of them bowling in day out for 5 days. How did they do that? And I mean, I can't see 4 bowlers bowling 90 overs.
Well, they didn't bowl for 90 overs a day. It was West Indies who invented our current crisis with over rates. They were bowling 65 overs a day in some days. They completely slowed the game down so they could bowl the 4 fast bowlers. Don't forget that Viv Richards, Carl Hooper quite often bowled very, very quickly at the other end off spin when they had to. Certainly got through some overs that way on occasion. But also their tests didn't last 5 days as much as other teams, so that helped them. They also had a very good backup system, right? A lot of their bowlers were the 5th or 6th or 7th best fast bowlers were incredible. So Roddy Eswick, who's their current fast bowling coach or bowling coach, is I think he's got a first class average of 22 for Barbados and never actually played a test match. So it tells you that even their backup bowlers, Sylvester Clarke, Franklin Stevenson, those, I'm trying to think who else, those sorts of players were absolutely incredible as well. There were heaps of Eldon Baptiste. There were absolutely heaps of them. So when they did have an injury or a bowler needed a rest, they could bring someone else in. But the main point was that they slowed the game down so much and they took so many wickets that they could do it. But yeah, I think they were all genuinely fast. I don't think don't think Joel Garner wasn't genuinely fast, if we're being honest. So I think they were all genuinely fast in that period, and the way that they did it was by slowing the game down, essentially, and it was probably bad officialing as much as anything else, and maybe bad lawmaking that allowed them to get away with that. It was far worse than it has been today. But teams do it for a similar reason today, right? You want your fast bowlers to be as rested as possible. And there were some very, very long overs back in those days of cricket, and it was not ideal, I suppose is the best way of putting it.
I have one more.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so the current Indian Test team, the bowling line they have probably their best spinner of all time in Ashwin, and they have their best left arm bowler Jadeja, and with that they have two quality Test match medium fast bowlers in Shami and Bumrah. So looking through all the
Did you
great
just call Bumrah medium fast?
fast medium,
Okay.
not medium fast medium probably. Yeah. But he hurries people, so that's different.
I mean, he's fast. I mean, I think we could. He may not be expressed, but he's fast. There's no doubt about that. I wouldn't want to face him.
Yeah, all right. He's not in the Pat Cummins and Kagi Sarabada kind of things. Anyway, so looking through all the great bowling attacks throughout the years, the West Indies didn't have a spin as we just discussed, and even going through some of the invincible teams may have, but it's just one of the best all-round bowling attacks of all time. Like the five, Bumrah, Shami, Ashwin, Jadeja, and you can add Siraj or Ramesh and there.
Yeah. Well, Australia only ever had four bowlers, didn't they? So by definition, I think India has them covered. As you said, West Indies never had a frontline spinner. Having said that, they didn't need a frontline spinner. So, it's a bit like saying, that football team has extra attacking midfielders and they weren't very good at defending, but they still beat every team by 3 goals, right? It's a tough one, depending on how you look at it. But again, they didn't have an all-rounder. The Invincibles, I think we have to be a bit realistic with the Invincibles. We're talking about one series there, or a couple of series, I suppose. But compared to consistent, they did have a fairly good, because they had Keith Miller, they did have a fairly good team. I think the team that would have been the best and might have actually pushed India's all-round bowling lineup would have been, had World War II not happened, and Australia would have been able to match up Clary Grimmett, Chuck Fleetwood-Smith, Tiger Bill O'Reilly with Keith Miller, Ray Linmore, as that attack, like that, a 5-man attack where you have a left-arm wrist spinner, 2 of the best leg spinners of all time, an all-rounder who can bat at number 4, and also bowl as fast as anyone in his era, and Ray Linmore. That would have been next level. Also, I'd have to go back and have a look at if any. I don't think Australia ever had a truly great bowling lineup when they had Richie Benaud and Alan Davidson together. I'm trying to think. But again, having those 2 all-rounders in your side, if they could have got the extra bowlers around, but I don't think they did. So I suppose hypothetically, the Australian War 11 would have been as strong as the current Indian 11. But if you're looking at having 5 bowling options, you'd have to go back and have a look at Pakistan when Imran Khan was batting top 5 and Abdul Qadir was in their side. I don't think they would have had it as often as India, but they probably, if you look at the 5 bowlers that they could have had Waqar, Wasim, Imran Khan, Abdul Qadir, and Sarfraz Nawaz. Maybe he was a bit finished by that point. Actually, I'm trying to think of who the other bowler would have been, but that would have been a pretty good bowling attack, right? And they dominated. They were brilliant. We don't give the Pakistan team of the 90s and of the 80s enough credit because West Indies was still slightly better than them. But that Pakistan team was absolutely destroying teams at times. So I would have thought that period of Pakistan cricket would have been one, because you really need the all-rounder, right? Jadeja is what makes this the great all-round bowling attack, because otherwise, it's not that much better than the West Indies or Australian bowling attacks. But the ability to have a fifth bowler in there gives you incredible all-round, versatility. The only other thing I would say about the Indian bowling attack is it obviously doesn't have a left arm quick, which is not bad. I think if you go back to that war team I was talking about before of Australia, the hypothetical Australian team, that wouldn't have had a left arm quick. West Indies only had right arm quicks, and Australia didn't have a left arm quick in their period. But that's sort of nitpicking at the absolute perfect bowling lineup. But I think the Indian one has to go down with that. But if you're looking over short periods of time, I wonder if Pakistan maybe did slightly better at times. And obviously, India didn't need the all-round nature of their bowlers, because the four were more than enough for them to dominate. But yeah, I do think India's got an all-time bowling attack, and I think I've said that many times before. I don't think Indian fans have become so... Indian fans have basically become a little bit like Australian fans did in the early 2000s, where nothing's ever good enough. And it's like, do you realize how much better you are than most other teams? And I think part of that is come down to the fact that they've lost a few of the finals. But if you're looking at it just from a team perspective, they're phenomenal. Thanks for that, Siddharth. Carrot diggers. All right, Hydrogen X might be struggling, but we've got carrot diggers.
Yeah, I'm on.
How you doing, mate? Which question?
Yeah, I'm good. I've got a question about grade cricket in Australia. I've heard you say previously that it's declined in the last 30 years. Like, I don't know. But I'm wondering if it's because of professionalisation of football. Because I've looked at this before. I reckon there'd be about 80 AFL players at least who would be playing grade cricket regularly in Melbourne.
Yeah, South Australia and Tassie as well. Yeah. I think that's played a part of it. How old are you, mate?
20.
All right, so I'm 40. When I grew up, the most important thing was on a Saturday for a lot of people that I grew up with in the outer suburbs, and my country friends were even more so. They literally, on a Saturday, you went to the sporting club and everyone played it, and it was the biggest thing. By the time I was 15, so 1995, we had about 3 shopping centers in my local area. We had none when I grew up. And people went to the movies and they went shopping and they went to arcades and everything. I think that has played a very, very big role in, diluting the talent out of club cricket in Australia. There's just more things to do. I had a friend actually, talking about Aussie rules football, who he played. He won the under-18 medal the first year they had it in the under-18 competition, playing for Northern Knights. And him and his brother were both absolute gun footballers, cricketers, tennis players, whatever. By the time they were about 25, 26, they'd stopped playing sport. And the reason was they were like, we spent our whole life on Saturdays playing sport. We'd now rather go watch a movie or, fish or whatever. So I think the culture of Australia changed. And so, back in those country towns that my family grew up in, I spent a lot of time in, on a Saturday night, it was like, the netball club, the tennis club, the cricket club, even the football club was the thing to do. And that wasn't now there are boutique bars, right? You go into Victorian and New South Wales places and you've got, beer cafes and you've got, family fun pubs and all these sorts of things. So I think the culture changed, but you're also right. I think in general, I think cricket's actually, personally, cricket's come back because of the amount of money that the players have made in the IPL and through the Australian team and through the Big Bash has changed. We had Alex Keith. Yeah, Alex Keith is a really important cricket person, despite the fact he ended up being a failed cricketer, because he's the first person.
Football, but he's a cricketer.
Yeah, but he was the first person to choose cricket over Aussie rules football, right? Before that, everyone else, like Shane, we only have Shane Warne because he was too short and too slow, right? Brad Hodge, we only have Brad Hodge for a similar reason. Sorry, Hodgie, if you're listening. But there's a lot of guys. Ricky Ponting is a fringe one. Ricky Ponting's dad said to him, mate, I think he played a game. He played a representative football game, and he said, look, if you're too good here, you're not going to make it. Matthew Wade, there's another one. Jamie Siddons, there's another one. Even Simon O'Donnell to a certain point. So I think you're right, but I think now there are people. Mitch Marsh, Alex Keith certainly had a choice of doing both. but you're also seeing the professional nature of Alex Carey and Alex Keith swapping sports, right? Because because the systems are so good, if you have someone like Alex Keith or Alex Carey in Aussie rules football or cricket and they fail in the other sport, you can still pick them up and know that they're very good athletes. So I think you're right to a certain degree, but I also think that the societal change in Australia is what has made club cricket a little bit weaker. But I think now there's been a pushback. I mean, what we're really talking about, mate, is that there's only so many professional athletes, right? So are you from Melbourne?
Yeah, I'm from Melbourne. Yeah.
So I always used to have this fight with my mates. I always said that Aussie rules football is the absolute worst thing for Australian sport, right? And I'm from Melbourne. I played it from a kid. I still follow the Pies. I love the sport. Don't get me wrong. But what it does is it basically takes the best talent away from our Olympic athletes, our basketball athletes, our cricket athletes, the sports that we actually want to go around the world and be really good at. And we've got, what sort of a point guard would Buddy Franklin have been? Sorry to everyone who doesn't follow Aussie rules on this. But and we've seen it again. So Josh Giddey had to make the decision between the NBA or basketball and football, and Mitch Marsh was another guy that had to do this. We could potentially be losing incredible athletes because they go off to play other sports. So I think Aussie rules certainly does do that. And it's not like as you and I both know that, but I'll use Buddy Franklin again. He is an all-time athlete and probably could have played any particular sport that he wanted to and been absolutely brilliant at it. And there's certainly been a lot of, I'm actually going to do a piece, funnily enough that you mentioned this, on Aussie rules impact on cricket, because it's had a lot of positive impacts on cricket around the world, because it was the first time, it basically brought professionalism into cricket, because cricket had to compete with what the footy was doing in Melbourne specifically, but also in Adelaide and Tasmania and Western Australia as well. So it's really, really interesting, but the sorts of players that we've missed out on over the years that we know probably could have come to cricket and should have come to cricket from they will play international sport perspective, but haven't. So I do think it has a big impact on it, but it's had some positives in cricket, but it certainly had some negatives. But I don't think you're wrong that it might have weakened that, but I think club cricket was being weakened just because of the way that Australian society was changing. But it's still a really big thing, and I'm sure in some of the smaller country towns, especially, if I remember. I played tennis to a very good standard and gave up tennis basically because I got bored of it and I didn't love the sport. But I picked tennis back up because in the outer suburbs, one of the great places to meet girls was at the tennis club.
Just playing tennis.
Right? And it's like playing cricket and footy's great, but it's like, basketball and tennis is where the girls were, right? So yeah. I'm not sure if in country towns, especially where the tennis, basketball, netball, football, cricket is all rugby league and union in some places is all in one place, if there's still a draw towards that. But I think in the suburbs you're more likely to find the girls probably in the arcades, right, or the movie theater, or walking around the shopping centers and everything. So I do think things have changed a little bit. But a great question, mate. Thanks so much for that. Keshav, you there?
Yep. Hi, Jarrod. Long time.
How you doing, mate? What's your question?
I'm good. So heard your podcast with John on Shane Warne. So John in detail told, how he reacted to it when he was in the train, when he got the news. So just if I may ask, what was your reaction like? What were you doing when you got the news?
I was doing podcast business, actually. We've been asked to join a new podcast network, which we haven't quite finalized, but we might be coming in with. And I had a really long chat with someone because I'm very interested in the podcast business world, and he obviously knew a lot about it. And then right towards the end, he said, I think you're going to have to go. Shane Warne's died. And I was like, that can't be the case, because I know that because my phone would be lighting up. And I forgot that at the start of the meeting, very professionally, I may add, I put my phone on Do Not Disturb. So I took the Do Not Disturb off, and he was right. I had about 90 messages, people trying to verify the story, to people telling me, to people asking me if it was true. So I didn't believe it, partly because when I was first told, I hadn't seen it myself. So my first thought was that. My second thought was trying to verify it. I verified it very quickly. Luckily, Mark Nicholas, well, not luckily, but Mark Nicholas had spoken to the family, so we knew it was true. That made my life a lot easier, because a lot of times what happens when, you know, especially someone like that, there's so many fake deaths. How many times has Jeff Goldblum died on the internet, right? I think it's quite a lot at this point. So, you know, the first thing is the verification. The next thing was, I was thinking that I had quite a relaxed weekend, and then that was gone. And I was in shock for quite a long time. I did TalkSport. I think I was on LBC in the UK. I knocked back a lot of the stuff straight away, just because I didn't have time to process it. Then I did Sky Sports News. Sky Sports News was like my last one. So I don't know how many media places I was on, but I was probably on 7 or 8. But Sky Sports News was my last one, and I probably did them all in a space of 3 hours, right? Or 4 or 5 hours maybe. And it was really after I did that last one and I sat down in quiet. It was the first time I wasn't writing or doing a video or doing stuff. And I think that was the first time I started to process it. And what happened was I realized that Shane Warne is the last cricketer I had a relationship with my father with, if that makes sense. So I left Australia in 2008, and Warne obviously retired in 2007. And from 2008 onwards, my relationship with cricket completely changes. You know, I'm not based in Australia anymore. I'm a cricket journalist, and I see the game very differently. Up until that point, you know, even if I had analyst tendencies and journalistic tendencies at times, I was still very much a fan. And that was, Shane Warne was the cricketer I went to watch with my father. You know, changed my relationship with my father in some ways. You know, then, and having that sort of lost link to my father, you know, it was probably where I felt the biggest pain. I wasn't particularly close with Shane, the person. I obviously met him, you know, quite a few times, interviewed him, occasionally had drinks with him, you know, chatted with him in press boxes and everything. But, you know, I didn't have a relationship with him that I did with Dean Jones, for instance, who obviously died. And I knew Dino a lot better than I knew Shane. So it wasn't a personal connection, but, you know, in some ways it was a very personal connection, as you might have heard in previous podcasts. You know, I grew up under Shane Warne, very much under Shane Warne in more ways than one. And as a cricket person in Melbourne, and you couldn't get away from him at that point. So he was always involved with my life and had been from the age of, 12 until 42. So I lived 30 years with Shane Warne in a very, very close way, you know, privately, cricketly, and professionally. And so, but weirdly, the thing that really hit me was the link to my father, and cricket had sort of been separated more by Shane's passing.
Yeah, I mean, I can relate to how you reacted a bit, because I was watching Batman and even my phone was on D&D mode. The moment the movie ended, I just walked out of theater and, you know, put the phone back on normal mode, and Twitter was literally, you know, shaken up by that. And I literally forgot everything about the film. I went into this shock, and, you know, I forgot what I just watched, and, you know, I was completely taken aback by it. So yeah, just a follow-up question. So since then, I've been seeing a lot of people sharing the Strauss ball as ball of the century. So, like, just want to ask you, why does the Gatting ball have the title of ball of the century? Who gave it to it? Because if you just see visually, like, you know, the Strauss ball has more of a shock value, that, you know, how can he turn from outside off to the leg stump?
I mean, the basic thing is that Gatting ball had already been called ball of the century. So, and also the Strauss ball's from a different century. I think part of the ball of the century thing was that cricket had evolved for 90 years, and then we suddenly get something like the warm ball. I don't think the warm ball to Gatting probably is the ball of the century. I think Usman Sami-Adin might have done something on a Wazam Akram delivery, but it probably has to be Wazam Akram or Shane Warne, just because they were the biggest outliers, I think, compared to any other great bowlers that we had. And we didn't really see Sid Barnes. Sid Barnes would probably be the other great outlying bowler, and we didn't really have. What Shane Warne didn't exist before, so I think there was the shock of that. I think it was called the ball of the century just by the English press at the time. I can't remember the exact journalist who gave it its name. I should remember that, actually. But, you know, I think it just became, you know, a very, very quickly a nickname attached to that ball. I don't think it's probably in Shane Warne's best 5 balls. I think if you go through everything, as you said, I mean, the one thing I would say is the Strauss one is affected by the foot marks. Now, he still had to plan it, and he still had to do it. He still had to execute it. Still had to hit the stumps, right? But that is the one difference there. But there was a lot of great balls from Shane Warne. I think it was the impact of that, and also then the impact that Shane Warne had from that point forwards that sort of cemented it. But it's a nickname. I don't think it was ever really official. And what was quite interesting is that when I did a tweet about the Strauss ball straight away. Up until Warne passed, I wouldn't have thought that, or, you know, maybe the Bazat Ale ball or the Shivnarine Chandra ball, you know, there was a lot of great, incredible deliveries. Herschel Gibbs one as well. I don't think until he passed, people like started really analyzing him. He sort of moved beyond analysis at a certain point, became a celebrity, and cricket content, I suppose. And in his death, I think people really started to go back and look at what he did. And, that's potentially why the Strauss ball sort of rose up at that point. Also, it's worth mentioning on the Strauss ball that his arm and shoulder were gone by that point. Like, not gone, obviously, but they weren't what they were. You know, the amount of rip he puts on the ball in the early 90s compared to what he was doing in the 2000s is not even comparable. So from a physical standpoint, the Strauss ball is remarkable. But thanks so much for your questions. Alex. Oh, you there? Oh, yeah, there he is. Alex, you there?
Yep. Yeah, I'm here.
Yeah, what's your question, mate?
So I just like to ask about Yorkshire's Johnny Bairstow. So in the back end of the Ashes series and yesterday, before yesterday in the West Indies test, he looks like he's actually turned the corner for once and found some form that looks sort of sustainable. Do you think that's the case, or do you think it's just another purple patch and a blip in his career in red ball cricket?
I don't think he ever had form. I think what he had was it took Test cricket a little bit longer to work him out, and part of that reason was that generally he's quite good in the where you bowl to Test bowl batters, right? So outside off stump, even at off stump, length, back of a length. He's quite good in most of those regions. Where he's not particularly good, which we found out very suddenly and very sharply, was if you bowl consistently full and straight at him. The problem is that why bowlers don't do that is that's a half volley length on the stumps, right? I think that he's either... I had a really big chat on TalkSport actually with Matt Pryor about this yesterday, and we're trying to work out if when he first came back, Alex, and he was trying to fix that problem, he tried to hit everything to either straight or to mid-on, which basically meant he didn't score very much because that's where you have fielders, right? And so bowlers would just continually go at the stumps until eventually he'd get frustrated and he'd try and flick one across the line and he'd be bowled or LBW again. Some of this, people go back to the footwork issue that he had with ODI cricket. I don't know how much all this is mixed up. What I do know is that at a certain point, bowlers worked out bowling full and straight at him was the best way to get him out. What has happened in this brief period that he's come back, and it is a brief period, is that he's found a way to score from the full and straight balls, which means that you can't put consistent pressure on him enough, and he's not missing them at the same rate that he once did. That might be a technical thing because he's closed off his front foot a little bit. It might just be that he's got away with it in a couple of test matches. It could be, that he's going up against bowlers who think they can get him out normally. I don't know, but I will say that West Indies did seem to bowl quite straight to him, and he did handle it. I think Freddie Wild gave me the stat that since he's come back to Test cricket, he's scored 54% of his runs on the leg side. Beforehand, it was 40%. Again, small sample sizes, who knows? But it feels like to me he's getting off strike when they're bowling full at the stumps, which is part of the problem. If you think about it, his full at the stumps is the same as everyone else's balls just outside off stump, right? And the best thing to be able to do with the ball just outside off stump is to be able to get off strike from it. So, Joe Root hits it to point and backward point. Kane Williamson hits it to third man. Steve Smith walks across the line, hits it to square leg, and Virat Kohli punishes if you get it slightly wrong through the covers. That's what you have to be able to do, right? To be able to skillfully manipulate that. So in Bairstow's case, if it's full and straight, he has to work out how to get off strike so that someone can't bowl consistently full and straight and try and get him out LBW and bowled. it feels like since he's come back, that's what he's doing. I think it might have been Freddie as well who told me that he doesn't get bowled as much now, and it's been more LBW. So even that, he's taken away one full, version of that. If all that holds up, Alex, then yes, this is very much this should be a permanent form. And if it doesn't, then very quickly we'll see him miss a bunch of straight ones and he'll go out again. I don't know is the best way of saying it. I think that for me, he's England's third best Test batter. Now, having said that, that's not exactly praising him. Extras was England's third best batter, right? So, but I do think he's the third most talented. I think when you look at when he goes back to county cricket, how much he dominates, he's on a completely different tier. I think he's a better player than Joss Buttler. And so I think he's worth persevering with. And if he has worked out this problem, I think you even give him a bit of a rope. If he can average 35 in the next 3 years, considering... Sorry, I've just booted my camera here. If he can average 35 in the next 3 years, I think that is just a huge, huge thing for English cricket because they haven't been able to find people who've even been able to do that consistently. But if he can do more than that, then that would be remarkable. Thanks, Alex. All right, last question is Gregory Paul. Gregory Paul T.
Hello.
There you go, mate. Last question. Knock it out the park.
So my question was regarding body type. Like we know that fast bowlers have to be like lean and tall, and I remember somewhere the batsman having a lower sense of gravity is sometimes useful as well. So what are some of the other like different body types that give them are at advantage?
Well, I did a video about this once. The absolute best wicket keeper would be someone with short legs and a huge wingspan. And that's because you want them to be as low to the ground as possible for when they're up at the stumps. But you want the big wingspan for when they're back so they can dive and cover extra ground for you. Fast bowlers do come in many different shapes. Obviously, I think the ideal would be someone with a very strong core who is, it's Kyle Jamieson is the ideal. You don't want tall and skinny, perhaps just because of the injury concerns that can bring about. So you want to be a little bit more solid through the centre. But we've had fast bowlers with very, there used to be the big fast bowling backside. Think of Brett Lee. There's some great old English bowlers who had that. Even Ryan Harris, I suppose, had that because it gives you a different kind of power through the crease. With spinners, you want longer fingers. What else do you want with spinners? You want, in fact, with all bowlers, you want hyperextended arms. I don't know if you're ever watching the video of this, you can see that I've got double jointed elbows. I used to have them on both sides until I busted the other elbow, but hyperextension of the arms is very important. I think Jofra and Jasprit both have that off the top of my head. I don't know if you want double jointed wrist as well, but I'm assuming that would be quite handy. Very, very, on wrist spinners, Shane Warne's probably, shown us that you want to be as strong as physically possible throughout the chest. So you want, you want the big shoulders and the there for the spinners. For batters, what you want is a very, very strong back. One of the reasons that when you talk about the low center of gravity on batters, that was always the thought. But don't forget that came from a period where the ball kept low a lot more, which doesn't happen as much. Now we have more short pitch bowling. So that has sort of changed. I don't know if anyone really believes the low center of gravity for batting anymore. In fact, it seems to be going towards taller batters. But what you do want is someone who has very, very good core and spine setup, because hunching over a bat for hours on end does, we've seen Michael Clark, Mike Atherton certainly have problems with that from a batting perspective. The other thing that you want is you want your front eye to be dominant. Seems to be something that we're learning. When you have your back eye dominant, which some batters do, quite often you end up having to twist your technique a little bit. Rory Burns is probably the best example of this. But I've talked to other batters who've said similar things. So I think those are the sorts of the major sorts of different kinds of body types or body advantages that you can get in certain kinds of players. I think core strength is probably something that is really important right across every part of cricket. So people with abnormally good core strength, should be able to find a role in cricket if they have other skills that can match that. I don't know how you work out if someone has abnormally strong core strength, by the way. Just punch them in the belly, like people did to Houdini, I suppose. But that is certainly one that when you look at the physicality. Sorry?
Do I have time for a follow-up question?
Yeah, quick one.
Who do you think are some of the real anomalies? Because the first thing in my head is like Chahal seems like really small for a leg spinner, and Chahal basically. So who do you think are some of the?
Was that sorry? You just cut out. Was that Chahal? You said.
Yeah.
Okay, so with leg spin, you really want to get the ball over the batter's eye line and then back under the batter's eye line if possible, if you're a flighty leg spinner. If that's the case, then being short actually helps. I've noticed that a lot of leg spinners in their teenage years, when they have their growth spurt, actually really struggle with leg spin. They're really good until the age of 15, and then they really struggle. I had that personally, but I saw much better leg spinners than me go through very similar things. So there can be advantages to being a shorter wrist spinner specifically. Finger spin, you probably want to be taller if at all possible. Stretch yourself. What are some of the other advantages? So outliers would be, having an abnormally low bowling action like Malinga. Mitchell Stark, Shaheen Afridi, Marco Janssen being 6'7" left armers. It's hard enough to find a left arm bowler. To find someone who's 6'7" and then is also 85, 90, 95 miles an hour is a huge advantage. I think Kyle Jamieson is a very, very perfect one there. Batting, traditionally, as you said, short batters were thought to be better. But if you have a look at it, I think KP, before DRS came in, KP, Shane Watson, Matthew Hayden, with their huge front steps, was an incredible advantage. Tom Moody probably was not in the same level as those guys as a batter, but used his height so brilliantly. I think he made 75, 80 first-class hundreds, Tom Moody. So having that step was very good. Also, having very quick feet. Neil Harvey was obviously very much known to have incredibly quick feet. Is, again, a very good. Also, you see that batters with... This might be a core strength thing, but it might not be. With abnormally good balance. Mark Ward, Damien Martin, VVS Laxman, players who, even when they're out of position, because their head is in such good position, they can still play shots that other players can't because of their balance, their physical balance. So that's obviously a very good one. Having abnormal... so most professional batters have a slightly higher eyesight, but not as much as you would think, because a lot of what they're doing, but having the ability to, so Graham Gooch, for instance, would give advice to other England batters, say, you can see at the top of his mark, he's doing this with his fingers. And I think it was Nasser Hussain who said, how can you see what he's doing with his fingers at the top of the mark? He's, 50 meters away from me. So having that, I think, is a very important thing. Brain elasticity is very important as well. So, if people have the ability to have better brain elasticity, it means that they can think more, because a lot of what they're doing is natural within their game. So it means they can probably think more tactically. I don't know how we work that one out. Quick hands is still a really important thing for wicket keepers and batters. I know in basketball, that's a really big thing of seeing how quick people's hands move. I don't know if we even test for that in cricket, but we know it's a very important secondary skill. Changing direction, the way that you run between the wickets is obviously, we don't need Usain Bolt. We really need I'm trying to think, is it Shelley-Ann Fraser-Price, who always has the best starts in the sprinting? We really need someone who's quick over 5 to 10 meters, not someone who's quick over 50 to 100 meters when we're batting. So that can be a huge advantage, getting out of the blocks very quickly. Those are some of the ones that, eventually it will be the ability to, to maximize height or minimize height, with different kinds of actions, I think will be very, very important going ahead. So those are a few of them. Thanks so much, Gregory, and thank you to everyone who came in again and asked their questions. Remember, if you came in halfway through the Spotify Green Room, you can go onto Red Ink and you can listen to the full podcast, and this will be up on YouTube as well. But huge thanks to everyone who came into the chat, and also everyone who helps us out on Buy Me a Coffee, and most importantly, the Patreon. That's what pays for this particular podcast, but also to Manscaped, who, of course, sponsor us at the moment. Lawnmower 4.0, put in the code REDINKA, get your discount. But huge thanks to everyone who came and everyone who listens to the podcast in general. And we'll talk to you again next week.